Welcome to the Portly Human Capital Squad Talk podcast, where we engage in conversations about the changing business landscape and how human capital and other C-suite leaders are approaching this. I'm Susan Gans, and I'm your host. I'm the Human Capital Squad leader for PortlyAI, as well as business strategist with Gans Strategic Solution. Today, we're doing a little something different on our podcast. Are going to have a panel discussion. So, as you know, human resources and culture have been evolving in the age of AI. So, today we've decided to have a panel discussion about this evolution and the corresponding workforce transformation. So I'm going to go around the screen and introduce our guests. So on our panel today, we have Heather Bussing. Heather is a California employment attorney with over 30 years of providing sensible and strategic advice to employers. Her deep experience with business, people, HR technology, and work gives her this very unique perspective focused on preventing and solving problems rather than fighting about them. She writes a regular column on employment law for the HR Examiner, consults with tech companies on compliance and content marketing, and works to keep her clients out of court and the news. And by the way, if that wasn't enough, she's the co author of the book Get Pay Right: How to Achieve Pay Equity That Works. But her primary role, and you'll see that she has a big sense of humor, is executive assistant to her dog, Carlos, who somehow now runs her life.
He does. I don't know what happened.
I think it was COVID, you said that happened.
Yeah, well, that too.
Next up on our panel is Ariel Goldfarb. He is the founder of Concentric Growth Partners, which is a governance advisory firm accelerating how CEOs and boards make decisions together. He draws on more than 20 years in research, marketing, and strategy consulting, including work with companies across energy, technology, and social enterprise sectors. He has been a faculty member at Northwestern since 2008, first as a lecturer at the middle school and currently as a guest lecturer at the Segal Design Institute at the McCormick School of Engineering. That's a
Awesome.
mouthful.
The mouthful.
Um, he's based in the Chicago area. So welcome to Ariel.
Thank you.
And
Good
we're
year.
you're welcome. And finally, we are so honored to welcome back Purvi Kondal to our podcast. She is the founder, inspiration, and CEO behind Portly AI. And she has a career, very distinguished career that spans very well-known brands in the supply chain transformation sector. She's worked in pharmaceuticals, retail, education, and finance. So, welcome to all of you, and so grateful to have you on today's podcast. So, let's start off the conversation, and please, whoever wants to jump in, jump in. So, the first question is, with the economy shifting in this AI era, what trends are you observing regarding human resources and C-suite leadership?
I'll go.
Awesome.
So the big thing that I am seeing is uncertainty and caution, because we are still trying to get our arms around the best, most effective use cases for AI and how employees use it, and balance that against the potential risks. Because if AI gets something wrong, the employer is on the hook. Regardless of what happens with the, tech company or whatever who is providing it. And the closer that AI gets to an employment decision, the risk goes up logarithmically. So, so we're seeing experimentation, excitement, but also caution in where this amazing new tool is going to be reliable and effective and contribute to the benefit of the companies using it.
And if I could just, I'd actually just build on Heather's comment, amidst that caution, et cetera, I'd say there's just a sense of acceleration. Like the big four, the four horsemen that you always hear about at the board level, cybersecurity, AI, kind of all the external volatility, VUCA, BANI, and then talent. Those are kind of the big four. But in part because of AI, and it's one of those four, it's just the complexity is brought around by the pacing, by the speed at which it's accelerating and I guess expanding too, the number of decisions that are rolling up because they're so consequential. So I'd say I would add on to Heather's answer there.
And I think if I can, you're both spot on. I would also say that I think historically we haven't probably paid attention to the talent side of the equation from a governance perspective, right, at the leadership or board level. And I think that's new, right? The boards weren't, was sort of largely left alone, within the HR realm. But now it's so important that the boards understand how to govern the talent, not even during the transition and also of the future, because we kind of don't know what the talent of the future is going to look like just yet. But in the meanwhile, we have a whole transition happening, and it's not going to be solved by existing HR leadership, right? So boards have to govern. It's a fiduciary duty because it's if we don't do this right, it's going to be problematic from a legal and market, all of that. Yeah.
And it may not be able to be solved by existing HR leadership, but I really think it's essential that it be solved with HR leadership.
Understood and agreed there. And there's a follow-up question that kind of leads into the next question, which is, what do corporate leaders and boards need to do to be successful? And so in being a student now of AI governance over the last few months, what I've learned and what's been drilled into my head is that corporate governance is very different from AI governance, and how AI governance needs to really take into account cross functions and collaboration, and that the ownership is across those functions as opposed to just siloed perhaps in technology. And there's lots of questions about, well, who owns that data? So to your point, Heather, about where in the chain does that data live, and where then is the liability? And it has so many implications for leaders and boards. So I will let you all take that question away. What does corporate leadership and boards need to do to be successful going forward?
Well, can I add a wrinkle first, actually?
Sure.
I see kind of a bifurcation here, and I'll start off with a quick story. I was at an NACD, National Association of Corporate Directors event, and it was a special luncheon that was sponsored by a technology company, of course, trying to get in good with all the directors. But what's fascinating is the conversation was all focusing on this notion of AI governance and AI and governance. And what was remarkable is that very few of the directors, they were really ready to jump in and think about how AI should be used in the organization. But no one was actually thinking about, okay, wait, how are we going to be using AI in the boardroom in our decision making? And when it was brought up by me, saying, what about this? It kind of locked up discussion. And so I think there's almost a bifurcation here um, around using, AI in the boardroom itself versus how the boardroom is going to set up the governance in the organization. And for my work, I live more in that decision making on the board. And so for me, and I'll just wrap up that perspective, is this idea of, just to resist the temptation to outsource decision making to AI because it's so easy, right? And it absolves some risk. And, this is kind of best practice. And the challenge though is that there's two things. Is that first, AI is trained on basically conventional thinking. It's like, what has everybody else done? And so that doesn't lead you to that differentiated judgment and the nuance, of the particular situation and context that human beings can bring, to the knowledge of a situation. And then the second part is that, and there's actually studies that's showing this really quickly on a human level, is that when you offload judgment, when you offload critical thinking, your critical thinking muscle starts to atrophy, and your mind kind of starts shifting. And so those are two things when we think about AI at the decision-making level at the board, on the board. And then maybe I'll hand over for the other side of it in the organization.
I can add on to that area. Like I think you're spot on, right? I mean, there's a thing around what the boards need to do for boards themselves, because right, I look at it as board is sitting at the top of the layer, if you will, structure. And right, the adoption and how to do it, the boards have to understand and be able to do it themselves, right?
Right, right.
Where you take it, trickle it down into organization, right? I kind of go back to this idea: boards don't want to do it, or any leader that says, well, it's for you, not for me, the talent's not going to adopt at all, right? So boards have to be the leaders they want to see in the organization culturally. C-suite have to be the leader. They've got to demonstrate that same action, right? Actions speak louder than words. And then you get, the rest of the org to kind of, see that, yeah, I'm doing it. And I think that requires a different mindset, right? From what was in the industrial era, right? So I think to me, I look at it and say, what is a future of thinking of what our talent needs to look like at every level? It needs to be different than what has been, right?
Mm.
Kind of my observation. Heather, your thoughts?
Yeah, AI is not just the next level of industrialization or the next level of efficiency. AI actually requires critical thinking. You have to look at an AI output and judge it, and in some cases, actually check its work. And so it's not necessarily more efficient when you get to a decision-making place. It can
Mhm.
be incredibly efficient at detecting anomalies and telling you how to fix them, at organizing information and summarizing it so that you can then um, go deeper in the areas where you have concerns or questions. But we are still figuring that out, and critical thinking, human judgment, and the context that Ariel mentioned are essential. We cannot use this tool without that. It would be like trying to use a bandsaw without goggles.
I love your analogies, Heather. And to build on that, two points that I wanted to make. So one is a prior guest had talked about how he doesn't use something unless he knows how it works. So his message is really know how something works before you deploy it. And the second thing, to the point about boards using AI and learning AI, about a year ago, a former professor of mine at Wharton mentioned, because I asked a question about AI in the boardroom and how is it being used. And he said, well, one of the companies, and he didn't disclose which public company it was, but one public company is using a AI board member,
Yeah.
and they have full voting rights.
A full voting rights, really.
Full voting rights. So
All the legal red flags are going up here.
Right, right.
I just wigged Heather out.
Well, I mean, how can a machine put values somebody else's interests before their own and make those kinds of judgments? They can't.
Yeah.
Especially with how AI actually works, which is math and fancy computing. there is no knowledge, there is no context, there is no judgment. It is amazing fancy computing, but it is data based on history with all its human biases. It is prediction based on math, and then the outcomes, which may or may not be correct. And there are lots of ways to manage for that. But if you're just importing, an LLM from one of the providers, there may be real issues.
So I'll add into that. I'll
Yeah.
say I would argue that I think that it's evolved a lot, right? Even in the last 6 months, I would say. So I'll give an example. I have a bunch of agents, right? What do we joke and say we call them juniors, right? I have a junior agent that has gotten incredibly insightful based on the learnings and training that we've done with it for the past year, to a point where I mean, we joke about this, right? We say, oh my God, do we need that thing anymore because it's gotten so good. So I think I do think that yes, it brings the historical, but it's also learning from who's training it, right? So
Yes.
the data that's old data that's just taking that piece of the puzzle, it's not as valuable because it has bias. But if there's a human in the loop and a flow that's actually continuing to correct that, it is mind-boggling where it can get to, right? Mind-boggling. I've been blown away. So it goes back to the point of the governance, right? So that how are organizations really governing? It's not about governing of a tool. It's really governing of the shift of how we reimagine work, right? That, and even at the board level, right? In that company, for example, did they reimagine the work, right? Is there a need to reimagine what and how boards do things today? Is there a need to reimagine what C-suite does today, right? Middle management, et cetera, right? And I think that reimagination is where a lot of the effort needs to be versus, let me just find somebody with a different skill set, right?
So that leads into very nicely to the next question, which is about cultures. Do you think that cultures need transformation in organizations given the state of AI?
I mean, yeah, I mean, to me, like the cultures are constantly in transformation, even, if it's deliberate or not deliberate, in terms of doing so. It's kind of interesting. Some people, I guess this is orientation and this idea of like, it feels like there's a permeating thing of you got to get on the AI bandwagon and we need to do whatever we need to do that. So let's transform our culture so that we can embrace it. And I'm just not sure that's really the best way forward. That's when you read like magazines like Fast Company, these magazines that make you feel bad because you're falling behind. I mean, I think that's where the zeitgeist is right now. And it's interesting because I just this morning heard a factoid that like, some CFO magazines reporting like 95% of CFOs are reporting that they're getting no ROI on any of their AI investment. And so, and then someone else is saying, this smells like 1999. For those
Yeah.
of us old enough to know what that means,
Yes. And
I,
the costs are changing.
all that
So,
kind of thing.
the whole math of it is changing.
Yeah.
And you guys are spot on. So one of the interesting observation I've had, and I kind of say when people say we need to transform culture, I'm kind of like, one, it took you a long time to actually get to that culture that you're at. And if your
Right.
culture for a very long time wasn't one that was about adaptability, about continuous learning, right? All of these other things, it's going to take you a lot longer at the speed. And if you're not going to be able to catch up to the AI speed, right? So I think that, right? So there's that piece of it. But then the other piece of it, I'm also kind of going, well, do you know what portion of the culture you really need to evolve? It's not an overhaul, it's not an overhaul, right? But that's how a lot of organizations are taking it. That's why we're seeing 30-40% layoff rate, all of that, right? Citing to the culture. But I'm kind of going, well, that's not the answer, right? How are you going to evolve the culture to be better when all you're doing is putting fear of God into every person that's remaining and who has left in the market, right? So this is where I go back to that boards need to pay attention to the culture and the HR dynamics. because what's been in that culture has long been standing, supported by HR for a number of decades. How do you now evolve that? And Heather, to your point, we may not have the right HR leaders that can help evolve it, but what needs to evolve needs to be understood before you start to just go wipe out people, right?
Well, and it depends. I mean, there are HR leaders that are, and HR has some really core skills that are invaluable in helping with this, which is change management, um, guiding conflict, helping people deal with new initiatives. They spend a lot of time and effort on that, and they actually have a good sense of how to roll change out in an organization if someone bothers to talk to them. But it's easy to go big or go home, and that's not what we're dealing with. Culture is a symptom, not a cause. And so what you need to do with culture is figure out exactly what you want to happen and why and how to get there and then help people do it. Sorry.
I just want to build on Heather. I hope I don't restate what you just said in a different way, but I think there's a big difference between aspiration and manifestation. And unfortunately, it's linked to roles, right? We talked about how the CHRO is elevating. They're now starting to get invited. Where I'd say historically, I mean, this is a really bad joke, but this goes back 20 years. But they talk about as you go up in the organization, typically HR didn't really was never seen there, as
Right.
much. And now it's really finally evolving because talent is emerging in such a clean area. But what you talked about it is, for me, you can say we want the culture to be like this, but basically behaviors create culture and decisions drive the behaviors. And the decisions that happen the higher in the organization they happen, the bigger those decisions and behavior impacts are. And I just see there's a big bifurcation, whether a CHRO brings in a talent culture firm to come in and put together the best of all plans. But if you're not getting support and the type of decisions, one decision made at the CEO level, the board level, um, it's so easy to undermine. And then not only you have a failed implementation, but the result of that failure of implementation, if you have any institutional memory, now increases the cynicism across the board. And I was at another NACD meeting. Someone asked this really comment of this panel, this really smart panel, and asked about, well, if AI is going to transform the workforce, but right now, generally the workforce really doesn't have much trust of the HR function at all to begin with. What are we going to do there? So that wise person made that comment, and I think that brings us back to, you can decide to affect the culture all day long, but it has very little impact compared to the decisions that are being made on high and how those resonate around, through the organization.
Yeah, and HR's stuck in the middle. I'll be the advocate for HR here. Um, because the leadership says, okay, make it so, and then they're charged with doing something that they may or may not agree with and may or may not have had influence over. And frankly, we're all really sick of having updates every other day that change everything we do. I mean, we are burnt out. We are burnt out by our technology. So the distrust is everywhere.
Yeah, a
And
lot of
and I
cynicism.
think it goes to Purvi's point that some of it is just the pace of change is more than our human nervous systems are capable and willing to manage.
So I'll
So,
bring up 2 points. One is a Wharton professor uh, that wrote the book Co-Intelligence, Ethan Mollick, positions HR as R&D and the organization as the lab and the people doing the experimenting in the lab. And um, he said he presented that concept at an HR conference, and he said that tended to resonate. So I think that HR has a huge role in impacting the people. I also see HR as the conductor as well, because they go cross functionally and they have a view, and then they have to marry that up with what are the business priorities and what are the levers that we can pull as the people function to help meet those goals. And then they have to work cross functionally and collaboratively to to figure that out. And so I do see a shift in HR, but it's with this lens of how do you become more of this business partner, where a true business partner, not check the box compliance business partner, but a business partner that's thinking about the future, where roles are going to be morphing and changing. And the other point I want to bring up is I heard another National Association of Corporate Directors person who heads up one of the regions, who said that learning velocity is going to be the new moat for organizations, because the rate at which people are now going to learn is something that's going to be hard to replicate in other organizations. And that resiliency, so that also ties into a culture of making learning a true value, so making that a decision, which leads to a behavior, which leads to a culture.
But if you have a if you have a technology that's giving you answers, how can you ensure that people are actually learning? Yeah, I think the risk is that they just outsource their thinking, and that's a real problem.
You're right, Heather, but I also kind of go back to that, right? If there have been leaders who basically, right, where they had a seat at the table, they could influence, but they didn't because they felt they couldn't, right? So that's no different than in AI or whatever the technology is giving this decision. So many times I know I've been on calls on the bank and they're like, well, that's what the computer says, therefore it is. And even though it's not accurate, right? So it goes back to that thinking process, right? And to me, I go back to leadership and, HR, right? As the leaders, they've got to step up to say, I'm no longer that leader who's just going to check the box. I'm no longer just a compliance person. But if we don't have those types of leaders in HR, how will the rest of the organization be able to do that, right? So I think it goes back to critical thinking, Susan, to your point, right? And how you learn. Learning mode is really important, but how do you enable people to learn when that's not been asked in the past, right? I've seen that in many organizations, right? Where learning HR would specifically say, oh, learning, oh yeah, let's not do that. Let's not worry about that, right? So how do that shift learning mode, how do you create that for people, right? In organizational culture.
So can I jump onto that with a quick question
Yes.
for you, Purvi? I mean, because the thought that just came to my head as you were saying that is that was kind of like the organizational perspective on learning. And this is what Portly has triggered a lot of thinking and wondering on my part, is I would say a lot of employees don't take a kind of like portfolio view of I'm in charge of my learning and development and career. They've gotten used to the machine that we all kind of have been living through. And what's interesting to me is that until someone says, you know, no, it's not just your LinkedIn profile of what you've done. Now, here's your cabinet. What are you learning right now? Here's what you need to learn. Oh, we looked at where you're headed, and you should think about doing this if you want to go there. Like all of a sudden you're like, oh, wait, there's some responsibility now to the individual. Now, probably a lot of us are type A types, right? So we don't, you know what I mean? Like we don't need to be told or thought that way because everybody's like that, right? But I think on a mass scale, I think it's an interesting, and that's why I'm curious about PortlyAI, that I think it in a lot of ways it just resets a game, and it asks a question all of a sudden, not just of the organizations who are facing their own talent challenges, but of the employee who, maybe is not an entrepreneur, has not worked for themselves, and, like type A chasing things, has
Right.
just worked through more conventional notions of employment, of going, oh, wait a second. And I mean, this is a bad story, but a friend of ours grew up in Detroit. And so because everybody they knew worked at car companies there, it wasn't a question. They would just always buy a brand new car. And then like this is, they're in their late 40s and they found out that sometimes people buy used cars and pay like a third less. And it was like this, like, whoa, I could just buy a used car and like pay like $10,000 less. And it was this kind of new knowledge for them. And I'm wondering with this notion of Portly and its value proposition on the employee side, there's with great power comes great responsibility, right? There's a lot of empowerment baked into Portly. So maybe I'll throw that at you. I mean, what is your expectation around employees? And is this a new ask on the employee side?
Yeah, so I would say organizationally, it's not a new ask. I don't think any CEO, C-suite, or board member, anyone I've ever met, HR leader or functional leader, they've ever said, I don't expect my employees to learn and manage their own career, right? I mean, that's always been a given. But I think what's been missing is that there's not the tools and the language that actually allows them to do that, right? It's siloed within the organization structures walls, right?
Mhm.
So all it is, well, I have my performance review, I have this, and it's kind of tied around what the organization's view of you is, not your view of who you are. And that's what we're breaking, right? We're breaking that to say, no, wait a minute. If these people are supposed to manage their own career, and we know, and they should have always been managing it, but they just didn't have the tools, right? And we know with the rates going down to less than 2 years, it's going to get worse. I mean, not better, right? And that portfolio-based work is going to be the future, right? It will be. It's not an if or, it's a matter of when and how quickly it gets there, right? And that's why we wanted to do this. We wanted to empower it so that, and you're right, employees do have that responsibility. I've gone through in my career where I unlocked the funding, I unlocked everything that was necessary, and the teams just didn't want to learn. They're like, oh, no, I'm too busy. So that self account.
That's it. That's exactly it. Learning is not the work. You don't get credit for it. And the breakdown is between the manager and the employee who's supposed to be doing the learning, because the pressure is on the manager for the deliverables, and learning is not a deliverable. So
Except,
well, it's the most valuable thing you can do, in my opinion, but you don't get credit for it. I mean, that's a place where we need to change the culture and change the metrics and change our perspective, because learning should be an absolute key component of doing work, and not just learning, the skills to make the deliverable, but critical thinking.
yes, and I will add to that that there are forward-thinking organizations, and IBM a couple of years ago started this, whereby as part of their performance management process, uh, each employee is measured on what skills they've learned over the last year, and this is for their base salary, and any changes in that are they're rated and graded according to that. Bonus has to do with results, but as part of their baseline, it's about what skills have you learned.
And that's part of a data collection thing by HR technology companies, because they're all trying to price skills so that they can price jobs. But but it doesn't necessarily address, how do we make learning part of the core work.
But wait, can I be counterpoint a little bit, Heather?
Oh, sure.
I mean, so this and I always end up on this thing. So I apologize for getting it so early in the podcast. But I think that when you get IBM, I mean, I think that demonstrates, to me, I really feel strongly about values, because, values drive behaviors, and those, values drive decisions, decisions drive these behaviors. And when, that example of IBM taking the time, the effort, measuring it, making it a judgment, on the performance of the individual, whether it links to a direct bonus, but just their assessment, they're being assessed on, are you learning? Like, to me, that's an organization, it's values learning. And they're putting, and I imagine they're putting dollars behind it in lots of different ways beyond the basic L&D, CBT,
Right.
you know,
Yes.
harassment videos you have to watch, you know,
Yes.
if that makes sense.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
I'm a, you know, big, and this goes back to the cultural transformation between HR, et cetera, is that, you know, the set of values and where we're headed to is we're going to soon, you know, it's like Warren Buffett used to say, when the tide goes out, you know, you're going to see people's values soon enough, whether they view talent, you know, if they view human capital as capital or they view it as cost of goods sold, you know, and just an expense. Because you're going to start seeing it now, because before, those on the kind of more cynical side was like necessary evil. And now with the advent of AI, you're going to get to, you know, see the values of leadership, management, which often these days tend to be, you know, 5 years at best, but board members much longer serving. The whole cultural is going to start showing itself to see where these values are. And I think, I mean, this sounds like the white horse thinking, but I think companies like IBM, these investing for the long term, investing in people, investing kind of what we all know inside what's right, are the ones who, you know, last 100 years, who are going to be there.
You're spot on, Ariel. Like, right, I look at it as, value statements, mission statements are in every company, but how much of that mission or value is actually being demonstrated internally within the organization, right? I equate it to, you can say that you're beautiful on the outside, but if you're not beautiful on the inside, it doesn't matter,
Yeah.
right? Like, and I think what AI is doing is it's going to expose. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of how quickly is
Yeah.
going to expose all of these misalignment of what we said to what we do, both at employee and employers, right? So the question, and this is why it's so important for the boards to be really getting involved in the culture governance or talent governance, because if it's not done right in a very quick manner, all it's going to take is one TikTok video or one something that blows up, that basically reduces the shareholder value, or puts such a big dent in it that it's hard to recover from. So that's why it's not an HR or CHRO decision. They've had that seat and that ownership for a long time, but it needs to be beyond that, right? And the only way it can get there is through the board oversight of the governance of talent, right?
Yeah.
And the values.
So I think the next thing I'd like to discuss is around getting the trust back into the system. I'll leave that as the next hot button to just push on, right? So some very well-known companies, as you know, have been laying off under the guise of due to AI or shifting resources to AI investments. So I'd love to hear, what are your thoughts about this trend? And then really, where do we go from here, and what are those skills that are going to be needed in organizations going forward?
Comment. This is something I recently just I was thinking about this. My comment is that every organization says they want to become AI enabled, or they want to become AI company that makes the stock prices go up. But my question is, do they know what it means? Does that mean that everyone's going to become a technology company, right? If that's the case, and if these are the tech firms that are laying off thousands of people under the label of AI, my question is, are these other industry companies, are they going to become, they're going to go hiring, AI engineers that cost $1 million a year? Are they ready to invest that to become AI company, right? If they're not, they're walking away from their core value foundation of the business, right? So that trust, going back, Susan, to your point, right? The trust that the employees, the people who are working, your suppliers, everybody has in the organizational structure, how is that trust going to be managed and, managed when you're a non-tech company, when tech company isn't able to get that, right? Does that make sense? So to me, I kind of go back to this idea of, who are you as an organization? It's no different than, back in the dot-com days. Everybody wanted to have a dot-com. They spent so much money, insane amount of money. And it's like, oh, that was just all about putting up a website and just, and maybe making it better and all that. I feel like AI has a lot of enablement capabilities, but I don't think that the leaders have thought through it enough to know where the right way, how to engage. And they're just calling out to be an AI company. And that's, I think, diminishing trust all over the place, right? And these kinds of examples don't help, right?
Yeah, I'd say that. I mean, I feel like the laggards are going to win here. Usually it's always want the leaders. I think the laggards are going to be the ones who are going to play it the best here. Is just going to say, let's watch other people's crash into the wall. Maybe we'll miss out on all the cool pronouncements of like, yeah, we're firing everybody, and they think they'll get a bump or, that type of thing. But the thing that so I feel like we've shared a lot of cynicism, and so I want to say, okay, what can I say about solutions? And I'll go back to Susan, the what you brought up. I align strongly with that. I think it was the professor you talked about who talked about, the research lab. I'm a big advocate of if you look at like best practices in innovation, innovation practices is about fast iteration. It is about doing lots of experiments and just minimizing the heck out of the risk of that experiment. Find the absolute cheapest, lowest risk way to test something and just try it at a very minimal, way, just to see and just sense and respond. What's happening? Okay, adjust. In doing so, as opposed to kind of an either or approach, and to me, I think that is, if like a CHRO is listening to this or head of HR who's struggling, saying, how do I get my CEO to go along, with this transformation, or how do I get the board along? And to me, it's all about saying, okay, how do I create an experiment that is such low perceived risk that the CEO, the board's going to say, well, yeah, let's try it, just see what happens, um, as a kind of a direction for doing so.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just employee trust, it's also trust of the market and consumers and people buying your products. And whether you're an information company or an analog, you make stuff company, and the calculations are different, depending on what it is and what you're doing. But I completely agree with you that the best approach is to start small and be careful.
But to start, you know what I mean?
But to start,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Where I'm observing it's about partnering with those that already they've put the time and capital into thinking about this, right?
Yeah.
Versus I'm gonna become an AI company, right? All of a sudden I'm a retailer and I'm gonna be AI tomorrow. And what does that mean exactly? It's that again, it's
What are
that
you trying to do?
well, their stock prices went up by whatever heck, X hundreds of percent. So I
Yeah,
understand why they're doing it, but it's also not sustainable nor scalable.
yeah.
Or possibly not practical.
That too. So, in wrapping up today's conversation, I'm going to ask each of you, what would you like the audience to remember about our panel today? So, Heather, I'll kick off with you. What would you like them to remember?
That there is risk in AI, but there is also value, and you need to try to figure out what problem you're trying to solve and how AI can help you do that, and do it cautiously with guardrails and try things to figure out what works.
Great. Ariel.
Um, I'm gonna I'm gonna pull out an old saying. I think it's supposedly it's an African proverb, but like it's if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. But I think
Right.
this really plays in here in the sense of, AI can make you so fast, right? Like all these things. But if you really want to, really have the positive long-term impact, it's really about bringing the people along, going together, figuring it out, and you're not gonna go as fast, but you're definitely gonna be more successful in the long term. And so it's a
I
take.
love that.
Amazing. Hervey.
I would say that our most important supply chain that exists in any organization, I don't care what industry, what size it is your people, right? And we have to start thinking about human capital as being capital and
Mm.
just a line item on a spreadsheet. If we want AI adoption to really work, we need to find ways to empower people and help them to recognize that AI is not in it to take my job, but AI can actually help me enable what my future is going to look like. And this applies to students who are graduating, to people who are working mid-career, to even senior executives, right? So we have to actually enable a culture that really actually in that that actually really helps people feel comfortable with experimentation and learning as the way to get there. Because without that, we're going to see a lot of failures, quite frankly, not on AI deployment, but quite frankly, a lot of organizations that, have been around for 100 years may not be, because of mistakes like that. So I got to go back to, I got to pay attention to the human capital that we do have. It's so critical.
Yes, and I've long believed that the humans and people are very important investments, no matter what type of company you're talking about, whether it's a service company or a manufacturer, because guess what? It's the people behind the machines making it go. But when I had that thought after college, I don't think people were there yet. So it really warms my heart that we're having this conversation many years later, that what I had seen early on in my career is enduring today. And if we treat people with dignity and respect and recognize their potential and make it okay to fail and to experiment, we go so much further. But I'll get off that soapbox and summarize what I heard today. So we started off the conversation about boards and rethinking boards. So how the board itself uses AI is as important as governance, and then things go from there. That we have to remember our human friends, that critical thinking and judgment and creativity are not to be lost and are very important. And with our friends in HR, for the evolving role is really about more aligning with business goals and rethinking opportunities of how people are deployed, how roles are evolving and changing, and thinking of themselves as R&D of sorts. We also talked about the importance of values, so the values of the organizations themselves then driving decisions and behaviors and therefore culture. And lastly, we talked about starting small and experimenting, and that you don't have to boil the ocean with AI. So I'd love to thank you all for participating and playing today. I love the robustness of the conversations, and I loved the back and forth. And so I want to make sure that all of you are going to be found. So I'm going to share your contact information. So the best way to contact Heather is via LinkedIn, and look her up under Heather Bussing, Bussing. The way to get to Ariel is twofold. Also, LinkedIn, Ariel Goldfarb. So it's Ariel, Ariel, Goldfarb, Goldfarb. And then Hervey, oh, and also his website, concentricgrowthpartners.com. And then with Purvey, you can find Purvey via LinkedIn. So Purvey is Purvee, Condal, Kondal. And you could find her on LinkedIn. You can look up Portly.ai or contact her directly at Purvey at Portly.ai. And with that, we're going to close out and let people know that if you'd like to find out more information about Portly and Squad Talk, please visit Portly.ai. And as we say here in the Squad spirit, keep growing and evolving and leading the way. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.